The humid, oppressive air of Port Moresby in early March 1943 was thick with the scent of aviation fuel, sweat, and desperation. Captain Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn, his hands perpetually stained with grease and engine oil, watched as the wrench slipped from his grasp, clattering against the rough concrete of the maintenance hangar. His gaze was fixed not on the fallen tool, but on the monstrous creation before him. This was no longer the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber that had rolled off the North American aviation assembly line. This was an abomination, a glorious, terrifying violation of every regulation in the United States Army Air Force technical orders. Where the elegant glazed nose of the bombardier should have been, there was now a solid, menacing cowling, pierced by the cold, dark muzzles of 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. This aircraft had been surgically transformed from an instrument of high-altitude precision into something far more primal and brutal, a low-level ship killer, a commerce-destroying predator. It was an illegal experiment, a project born not from a Pentagon directive, but from one man's simmering fury and a theater commander's desperate gamble. Captain Gunn knew that this unauthorized modification could either revolutionize the air war in the Pacific and save countless Allied lives, or it would see him stripped of his rank and cast into a court-martial. What he, General George Kenney, or anyone else in the Allied High Command could not possibly foresee was that this act of mechanical rebellion, conceived in a sweltering Port Moresby hangar, was the catalyst that would set in motion the most catastrophic and one-sided defeat the Imperial Japanese Navy would suffer in the entire Pacific campaign. The complex equation for Allied victory in the Southwest Pacific was being solved not by strategists in Washington, but by a 43-year-old maverick and his team of welders and mechanics, a man waging a deeply personal war against the empire that held his family captive. The long, arduous journey to this pivotal moment had begun over 2 years earlier, half a world away, under a sky blackened by enemy aircraft. On December 8, 1941, Manila time, Paul Irvin Gunn, a man whom no one yet dared call Pappy, stood on the tarmac at Nichols Field, his heart sinking as he watched wave after wave of Japanese bombers methodically dismantle the American air power in the Philippines. As the manager of the fledgling Philippine Airlines, he commanded a small fleet of 4 civilian Beechcraft 18s. Within hours of the devastating attack, the grim reality of total war descended. Major General Lewis H. Brereton, recognizing the immediate need for every available aircraft and experienced pilot, commandeered Gunn's civilian planes and commissioned him as a captain in the U.S. Army Air Corps. What should have been a temporary commission for the duration of the emergency would instead blossom into a multi-year odyssey defined by relentless innovation, a thirst for vengeance, and a technological upheaval in aerial combat doctrine. Gunn was no fresh-faced junior officer. At 42 years old, he was a seasoned veteran of naval aviation, a former chief petty officer who had dedicated 20 years of his life as an enlisted naval aviator before retiring in December of 1939. He had learned to fly in the barnstorming era of the 1920s, had served with the legendary Top Hatters Fighter Squadron, VF-1, and had honed his skills as an instructor at the prestigious Pensacola Naval Air Station. His understanding of aircraft was not academic. It was visceral, earned through 2 decades of hands-on maintenance, countless hours in the cockpit, and the hard-won lessons of surviving several crashes. But on that fiery December morning, all his technical expertise felt meaningless. He was confronted with a more immediate and terrifying problem. His wife, Clara Polly Gunn, and their 4 children, teenage sons Paul Jr. and Nathan, and younger daughters Connie and Julie, were trapped in Manila as the Japanese noose tightened around the city. Their comfortable expatriate life had been obliterated overnight. In the chaotic and desperate weeks that followed, Gunn flew a punishing schedule of reconnaissance and transport missions across the rapidly disintegrating Philippine defenses. He dodged Japanese Zeros with instinctual skill, survived being shot down over dense jungle, trekked to safety through hostile territory, and, with barely a moment's rest, climbed right back into the cockpit of another aircraft. On one particularly audacious mission, he earned the Distinguished Flying Cross by piloting an unarmed transport plane directly into besieged Bataan to deliver critical medical supplies, navigating through skies controlled by the enemy with nothing but sheer nerve and superior airmanship. Yet, for all his bravery and skill, he could not reach his family. The Japanese advance was too swift, the chaos too overwhelming. On Christmas Eve 1941, Gunn received the orders he had both hoped for and dreaded. He was to evacuate key personnel to Australia. He immediately drew all his military pay, borrowed every dollar he could from sympathetic fellow officers, and prepared to get his family to safety. But the Japanese stranglehold on Manila was complete. His family could not fight their way through the chaos to reach the airfield in time. Gunn was forced to make an impossible choice: abandon his wife and children to an uncertain, terrifying fate, or disobey direct orders in a losing battle. With a heavy heart, he chose duty, flying to Australia because orders were absolute, because the war was a cause greater than any single family, and because staying in the Philippines meant certain death or capture. It was a decision that would haunt him for the next 3 years. Within weeks, on January 20th, 1942, his worst fears were confirmed. Polly and the 4 children were rounded up by Japanese forces and interned at the University of Santo Tomas, which had been converted into a squalid camp for enemy civilians. The news shattered something fundamental within Paul Gunn. The man who continued to fight was a different entity altogether from the one who had left Manila. He had been compelled to leave his entire world in the hands of an enemy notorious for its brutality. Every single day his family remained in that camp, suffering deprivation and fear, was a day he had failed in his most sacred duty as a husband and father. The only recourse, the only way to salve his guilt and fury, was to end the war faster. If he could not personally liberate his family, he would dedicate himself to destroying the very logistical backbone that sustained the Japanese war machine in the Philippines. This was not a calculated military strategy handed down from on high. It was a crusade of vengeance, meticulously disguised as technological innovation. When Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Brisbane in late July of 1942 to assume command of the Allied air forces in the southwest Pacific area, he stepped into a theater on the brink of collapse. His predecessor had been relieved of duty, morale among the air crews was abysmal, equipment was outdated and inadequate, and the Japanese held almost uncontested control of the skies over New Guinea, directly threatening Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, the theater commander, held his air force in open contempt and did not hesitate to lecture Kenney for an hour on its profound shortcomings. Kenney, a 53-year-old World War I fighter ace with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star, was cut from a different cloth. A former instructor at the Air Corps Tactical School known for his unorthodox and aggressive thinking, he listened patiently to MacArthur's tirade and then made a simple, startling request: the authority to send home anyone he considered dead wood. A surprised MacArthur agreed. Within weeks, Kenney had ruthlessly reshuffled his command, promoting aggressive young officers and establishing a forward headquarters in New Guinea under the command of Brigadier General Ennis C. Whitehead to expedite decision-making. Yet personnel changes alone could not sink Japanese ships. The prevailing doctrine of high-altitude bombing was proving to be a catastrophic failure against naval targets. The formidable B-17 flying fortresses, bombing from thousands of feet, were achieving a hit rate of less than 1%. Agile Japanese vessels had ample time to maneuver, rendering the expensive and complex Norden bomb site nearly useless. Japanese convoys resupplied their garrisons in New Guinea with impunity, while Allied soldiers died in the fetid jungles, starved of support. Kenney had theorized about a solution to this problem as far back as 1928. The concept was skip bombing, a low-level attack run where bombs were released at masthead height, skipping across the water's surface like stones to slam into the vulnerable sides of ships below the armor belt. The physics were sound, but the execution was suicidal. Aircraft like the B-17, designed for high-altitude flight, lacked the forward-firing armament to suppress the withering anti-aircraft fire they would face during a slow, low-level approach. It was at this critical juncture that Kenny discovered the unofficially modified A-20 Havoc light bombers of the 3rd Attack Group and the man behind them, Captain Paul Gunn. Investigating reports of unauthorized field modifications, Kenny found Gunn working in near isolation, a one-man innovation hub scavenging 50-caliber machine guns from wrecked P-40 fighters and crudely but effectively mounting them in the noses of A-20s. Most commanding officers would have court-martialed Gunn on the spot for such flagrant disregard for regulations. Kenny, however, saw genius. He immediately assigned Gunn to his personal staff as a special projects officer and handed him an impossible mission: modify every A-20 in the theater for low-altitude strafing and attack, and do it immediately. Gunn embraced the task with a ferocious intensity, working 18-hour days in makeshift workshops. He personally fabricated mounting brackets, scavenged weapons and ammunition, and test flew each modified aircraft himself. The result was the A-20 Strafer, its transparent nose replaced by a solid one housing 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, with additional guns sometimes mounted along the fuselage. Their combat debut in September 1942 against the Japanese airfield at Buna was a revelation. Coming in at treetop level, their guns blazing a path of destruction, they suppressed anti-aircraft emplacements before delivering their bombs with devastating accuracy. The Japanese, accustomed to the slow, predictable approach of high-altitude bombers, were caught completely off guard. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Kenny had his proof of concept. He immediately ordered Gunn to apply the same transformative treatment to the larger, more powerful and longer-range B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 Mitchell was a twin-engine medium bomber, a workhorse with a wingspan of 67 feet, powered by 2 1,700-horsepower Wright R2600 radial engines. Its standard armament consisted of a handful of defensive machine guns and up to 3,000 pounds of bombs delivered by a 5-man crew. It had earned eternal fame in the Doolittle raid, but in its standard configuration, it was as ineffective as the B-17 against maneuvering ships. Gunn partnered with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative who became his willing co-conspirator, looked at the B-25 and saw untapped potential. The project began in a maintenance hangar in Townsville, Australia, far from the prying eyes of stateside bureaucrats. The transformation was radical. The first step was the removal of the bombardier and his vulnerable glass nose, saving weight and eliminating a now useless crew position. In its place, Gunn installed a solid metal nose packed with 4 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all linked to fire forward on the pilot's command. Not content with 4, he added 2 more package guns in blisters on the forward fuselage, outside the propeller arc. Then, in a stroke of brutal pragmatism, he locked the aircraft's dorsal turret in a fixed forward position, adding its twin 50 calibers to the pilot's arsenal. The final creation was a flying battleship, 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns, capable of unleashing approximately 180 pounds of projectiles per second, the concentrated firepower of more than a full squadron of fighter aircraft, all directed by a single trigger pull. The engineering challenges were immense. The added nose weight dangerously shifted the aircraft's center of gravity, requiring careful repositioning of equipment and ballasting in the tail. The simultaneous recoil of 8 guns threatened to shake the airframe apart, necessitating extensive structural reinforcement. Gunn personally oversaw the painstaking process of harmonization, ensuring all 8 guns converged their fire at a precise point, several hundred yards ahead of the aircraft. He test-fired each installation himself, refusing to release an aircraft until it met his exacting standards. By December 1942, he had modified enough B-25s to equip the 90th Bombardment Squadron, which was placed under the command of Major Ed Larner, a pilot whose aggressive instincts and understanding of low-level tactics made him the perfect weapon for this new system. Larner and Gunn developed a devastatingly simple and effective attack profile. The modified B-25 Strafers would approach their targets, Japanese ships, at wave-top height, sometimes as low as 50 feet, flying at maximum speed. At this altitude and velocity, they were nearly impossible for shipboard gunners to track. At about 1,000 yards, the pilot would open fire with all 8 guns. The storm of lead would sweep the ship's decks, silencing anti-aircraft crews, shredding superstructures, and sowing chaos and terror. Then, at a mere 200 to 400 yards, the pilot would release bombs fitted with delayed fuses. The bombs would skip across the water like stones, slam into the ship's hull below the waterline, and sink just enough for the delayed explosion to occur inside the vessel's most vulnerable area. The concussive force, magnified by the incompressibility of water, could break a ship's keel. The entire attack, from the first burst of gunfire to the bomb release, was over in less than 10 seconds. By the time the bombs detonated, the B-25 was already climbing away from the blast. While Gunn was forging this new weapon, Allied intelligence was providing the perfect target. Through the top-secret ultra-code-breaking operation, commanders knew that a massive Japanese convoy, designated Operation 81, was assembling at Rabaul. It consisted of 8 transports carrying nearly 7,000 troops of the 51st Division, escorted by 8 destroyers, all bound for Lae, New Guinea. This was a maximum Japanese effort to reinforce their faltering position. If it succeeded, the Allied advance could be halted for months. If it failed, Japan would lose an entire division, and its ability to conduct major sea-lift operations in the region would be crippled. General Kenny saw his opportunity. He assembled every available aircraft, B-17s, B-25 Strafers, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, and P-38 Lightning escorts for a coordinated annihilation. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea commenced on March 2, 1943. Initial high-altitude attacks by B-17s were largely ineffective, as expected. But on the morning of March 3rd, under clear skies, the main assault began. The B-17s drew attention high above, while the low-level killers swept in. RAF Beaufighters made initial strafing runs, and then the modified B-25s, led by Larner, struck with surgical, merciless precision. The scene that unfolded was one of unparalleled destruction. Transport after transport was targeted. A B-25 would drop to masthead height, its 8 guns erupting in a blinding, deafening torrent of fire that walked across the deck of a ship, turning steel into shrapnel and men into casualties. Seconds later, the skip bombs would fall, skipping once or twice before smashing into hulls. The transports Kyokusei Maru, Kembu Maru, and Teiyo Maru were among the first to be shattered by internal explosions and sink. The destroyer screen suffered equally. The flagship Shirayuki was crippled by strafing, and a bomb hit and sank. Tokitsukaze and Arashio were blasted into sinking wrecks. The coordinated attacks, repeated over several waves, were a masterclass in the new tactics. By day's end, the victory was total. All 8 Japanese transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers lay at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed, and only around 1,200 demoralized and equipmentless troops ever reached Lae. Allied losses were minuscule, a handful of aircraft. The battle was a strategic earthquake. It proved conclusively that land-based air power could destroy a heavily escorted naval force. It validated every one of Kenny's theories and every one of Gunn's unauthorized modifications. Most importantly, it broke the Japanese Army's faith in sea-lift capabilities. Never again would they attempt a major convoy to New Guinea. The garrisons there were left to wither on the vine. For Paul Gunn, watching from Australia, the victory was a grim satisfaction. His creation had wrought a mighty vengeance, but his family remained in Santo Tomas. The success led to an official embrace of his work. He was promoted to major and then lieutenant colonel and sent back to the United States to work directly with North American aviation. His field modifications became the basis for the factory-built B-25G, with a 75mm cannon, and the even more heavily armed B-25H and B-25J models, the latter becoming the most produced variant with up to 1850 caliber guns. Over 10,000 B-25s were built, and thousands were configured as strafers, a testament to Gunn's vision. For the remainder of the war, B-25 Strafers wreaked havoc across the Pacific, dominating the battles of Wewak and Rabaul, and providing devastating close air support during the Philippines campaign. Gunn himself continued flying combat missions, a 45-year-old lieutenant colonel driven by a private war, until he was severely wounded by shrapnel from a Japanese bomb in late 1944. His combat career was over, but his war was nearly won. On February 3, 1945, U.S. cavalry troops liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp. Polly Gunn and her 4 children had survived 3 years and 14 days of hardship. They were emaciated and traumatized, but alive. The family was miraculously reunited weeks later. Paul Pappy Gunn retired from the Air Force as a colonel in 1948, his chest adorned with a silver star, 2 distinguished flying crosses, and an astonishing 9 Purple Hearts. He returned to the Philippines to rebuild Philippine Airlines. His life, forged in the crucible of war, ended as it had been lived, in the cockpit. He died in an air crash on October 11, 1957. His legacy, however, is indelible. He was the quintessential American innovator, a man who, driven by personal tragedy and a refusal to accept failure, looked at a standard-issue weapon and saw a better one, then broke every rule in the book to build it. The modified B-25 Strafer was not just a machine of war, it was a physical manifestation of relentless determination, a weapon that changed the course of a theater and shortened a war, all because one man decided that the existing tools of victory were not enough.